Hey guys, welcome back to our channel. This week we're going to be teaming up with my husband. He built me a new desk and we're going to show you a little time lapse of us creating it. It's about 6 foot long, 3 foot wide. We got most of the lumber from a local store, a local hardware store. Anytime we can support local, we do. Everything else we got from Lowe's Hardware. I'll put casters, which we did get from Amazon, down below in the description box, and I will link things that we got from Lowe's, like the pocket hole jig and other items, down below in the description box as well. And you ready to get started?
Let's get it.
Alright, we're gonna get started. Thanks for watching. Be sure to look for us on Facebook, TikTok, and Instagram. Here we're going to cut all the lumber to size, and we're going to start with the frame first. Please ignore our messy floor. We have worked on a couple different projects. No need in cleaning up until the very end, right? So we're going to do the top frame first, and we're measuring out both the front and back and the two sides. And then we did put a support beam in the middle. This table has 2 layers, a middle shelf that's probably about half the length of the table, and then it also has a top shelf that I added onto the original specs of this table, and I will add the original link, or the link to the original blog that I got this idea from. I came across the idea on Pinterest and found the blog that went with the picture, and we, for the most part, went by the specs that were in the blog. We did tweak a few things. I tweaked the height of the table so that it would be a good stand-up height for me to work standing up without having to bend over, or I could get a tall desk chair and use that as well. I did change up where I purchased materials from a little bit, and I added that top shelf, and I will show you pictures at the very end on why I added that top shelf. So we're still working on the frame. We're doing the bottom frame now. Like I mentioned in the beginning, the table is about 6 feet long, and it is about 3 foot deep, and the height is just over 3 feet. I think it's about 4 inches shy of 4 foot tall, and that's from the carpet to the very top of the main part of the table. That does not include the height of the top shelf that I added on. Now we're cutting the legs. Whenever I show you the pictures at the end, you'll see the legs from the front look wide. That's because we used 2x6s for the front of the legs, and then for the rest of the framing on the table, it is all 2x4s. The 2x6s was only used for the front of the leg and the back of the leg. And then there's also a support block at the very bottom of the leg that the casters are screwed into. I'm going to let this fast forward here so you can see us finish cutting for the most part the rest of the framing. I do not include showing every single piece that we cut just to save on time. Here you'll see where my husband did not saw correctly. He marked it at 5 inches, but instead of cutting to the outside of his marked line, he cut to the inside of his marked line, which meant that the block was short by the width of the saw blade. So whenever you're cutting, you do have to factor in the width of your saw blade. That is why you don't see him marking a whole bunch of pieces at one time and cutting a bunch at one time. It is just easier for us so that we didn't have to measure the saw blade. I don't know if that makes it easier or lazier. One or the other. So we just mark one piece at a time and cut that rather than measuring and marking several pieces and cutting those. That way we don't mess up with the width of that saw blade. We do use this Craftsman, I think it is a sliding miter saw. I may be wrong, but I think that's what it is. We use that to cut all of the framing, all of the legs, and then we used a skill saw to rip down the tabletops, which you'll see in just a few minutes. This is me showing him the top shelf that I wanted to add on and giving him the measurements for that. Like I said, that part is not in the specs, so I kind of just went off my imagination on what I thought I wanted it to be, and it worked out pretty much the way I wanted. I did change it up a little bit at the end, which made us have to recut the molding pieces, which have not been added to my table yet. My husband's getting a little bit behind. So we are cutting those pieces for that top shelf. And I wanted that top shelf. The main reason I built this table, or had my husband build this table for me, is for my Cameo Pro. I did not have a desk or a table big enough for it, so I knew I was going to have to custom build a table that would hold it. So that's mainly what I built it for, but I also have a Silhouette Cameo 3, and I'm not getting rid of it, but I still wanted it to have a place rather than having to move it down and around every time I wanted to cut. So that top shelf that I've added on, that is for my Cameo 3, and it sets up there. It has a home of its own, and it doesn't take up any of the actual table space. Here you'll see us cutting the 1x2s. We're using that for it's kind of like a molding or like a framing. It makes the table look very finished, and it's not finished because we haven't finished putting it on. My husband does have to finish putting that on. We've gotten a lot of rain this week, so I cut him a little bit of slack. So we're just going to cut those framing pieces, the molding pieces. And he'd never mitered ends before. He's always done cross cut or straight cuts. And so both of us are learning the 45-degree angle and making sure that we got it cut correctly. And whenever we did put the molding or this little piece around the top of the table, we did fairly good. There was only one spot where we cut a little bit short and had to alter it once we got it on the table. So not too shabby for our first try. This table also has turned out to be a great spot for me to do my videos. I share this craft room with our 2 fur babies, and they have shelves on the wall, which you may have seen part of in the introduction, and that way they can get up high or almost all the way around the room, and I can hook my ring light to one of the shelves that is above the table and actually have the light angled down onto the table, and it works out really well. So I'm actually able to do my Facebook group lives on this table, and I can film YouTube videos on this table. So it's definitely going to be a multifunctional table. I think in total I spent, because lumber prices have went up recently, I haven't exactly added it up price by price, but I want to say that it was somewhere around $250 to build the whole table. I did spend more for this piece here, the tabletops. It is MDF, and it is all that Lowe's had. I did want something different, but they were out of stock. therefore, you know, sometimes you have to take what you can get. So I did end up having to use this, which is 4 foot by 8 foot and 3/4 inches thick, and it is MDF board. At the end, when I post some pictures, you'll see that I have covered the very top. MDF board is kind of like a mashed together paper, I guess. And if it gets wet, it kind of stains and it can warp. So I put a shelf liner on the top of it in hopes that if I spill anything, or if I set a drink or a bottle or anything that sweats or spill water or alcohol or acetone or anything like that on it, that it'll be somewhat of a barrier to help prevent that MDF board from staining or warping or anything like that. We did use screws to put everything together, so hopefully if anything happens to it in the future, hopefully it doesn't, but if anything does happen to it in the future, we can just take the screws out, pop it out, and put something different down. Here my husband is just ripping that piece of MDF down so that it is the exact measurements that we need. And then we're going to go into the house and start putting everything together. Here we're in our space, and that blue thing is the best tool that I have probably ever purchased for woodworking, and I don't know why I have not purchased one before now, but it is a brilliant tool. It's a pocket hole jig. It's called a Craig pocket hole jig. And it comes with, I believe, 3 pieces, and you can take them apart and space them out. You can take it down to 1 piece. Here he's trying to use another piece, but it just didn't work for us. But for this particular project, you'll see that we just have the 2 pieces together without a spacer. And you just clamp. There's a little gray piece on the bottom, and you use that to set your depth. Depending on what material you're using and what size screws you're using, use the little guidebook, and it tells you what depth to set the jig to, what depth to set the drill bit to, and what size screws that you'll want to use. It's a brilliant tool. So you hook it to one end with a clamp, and then you drill in the 2 spots, and then you'll see here as we're attaching, you just put the screws in and drill the screws in, and you don't have any screw heads. There's no screws visible from the outside. It just looks really clean and professionally put together. I have plans to use that jig on sign panels, and who knows what else we'll be putting together with them. It's definitely a good purchase. It was a little pricey. I believe at Lowe's, and I'll link it below, but I want to say it was somewhere close to $40 for the kit, and it came with, like I said, 3 or 4 pieces. It came with a little place to hook to the jig for a clamp, and it came with the drill bit, the screwdriver bit, and I believe it came with like 40 screws, if I'm not mistaken. Craig sells, and I hope I'm saying that right, they sell the pocket hole screws, but what we did was we went into the hardware section at Lowe's and found, I believe it's the Hillman brand of pocket hole screws. Like I said, I will link those below. And they were cheaper, and they were the exact same thing. So that's what we ended up doing. I believe we got 3 boxes of those. So what we did was we put that bottom frame together, and now we are attaching the legs to the bottom frame. And then we put the top frame on the floor and then rolled the framing that we already attached the bottom to over on top of the top part of the frame. And then we were going to go ahead and put the screws in, and I told my husband, I said, we have to make sure that the top of the legs are level with the top framing so that whenever we put the tabletop on, everything gets flat. So I went out and got those 5-inch boards that you'll see what we do with here in just a moment to put underneath each leg so that the top framing is level with the leg, and it worked out wonderfully. So we didn't have to do anything funny here getting that top framework hooked to the legs. Your legs set on the outside framing of the bottom shelf, and they are recessed into the top part of the table. Everything flows together really, really seamlessly. We did not pocket hole the putting the legs on because we could screw from the inside of the legs to the outside without any issues. And then once we got that done, we pulled those little 5-inch pieces out and we screwed them to the bottom of the legs, which is where the casters will screw onto, and then flip the table over. And now we're putting that bottom shelf in, which was cut extremely tight. So we had to do a tad bit of sanding where it wasn't quite cut straight. Craig does sell a jig that you can hook to a skill saw, which we may invest in the future, and it'll allow you to cut straight edges while using the skill saw. That's also brilliant. But here we were able to just maneuver this panel in to make that bottom shelf, and it ended up being okay. I think we got for one of the other shelves was also tight, and we ended up having to get a rubber mallet to get it in. So now we have this bottom shelf in, and we're just gonna sew that. In the original specs, it calls to put brad nails in the tabletop to nail it to the framing, but so that it'll be easier for us to take this table apart if we ever want to in the future, if I move it to a different room, or if I get a building and put all my stuff out into a building, it'll be easy to take the table apart, move it, and put it all back together. We didn't use any glue in any of the joints or screw holes. We just used screws to put everything together. The only thing that we used nails for was the molding that we put around the table. That is our little floofer. His name is Aztec. We call him Tech for short. You may see him quite often in our videos. And our orange baby is called Bit. His name is actually Cheddar, but I call him Bit and the name kind of stuck. And he will most definitely make appearances in videos. He is definitely a camera hog. Loves to help. He is always by my side, and you'll probably see quite a bit of him in this video, and I'm sure you've seen him in other videos. If you watched our last video, he made an appearance in that one as well, and he helped me try to pour some crochet hooks. This is the little half middle shelf, and it's just the framing that we're putting together here. Again, we did the pocket holes, and my husband is screwing that framing together. Getting quite unique here and using his knees to hold it. And we're going to move that framing up to the top of the table so that it's easier for us to put the brackets, I guess you would call them, onto the framing. And what this is going to do is these brackets we're screwing in will actually connect to that middle support and hold up the shelf. And there's some smaller supports that we attached to the inside of the legs on the end of the table to hold up the other side of that shelf. And again, we didn't use the pocket hole here because it's not going to be seen. It's underneath the table. So we just screwed in directly from the outside of the 2x4 there into the bracket. And we put one on each end and one in the middle, lined up with that middle support there. And for the screws, I believe we used 2.5-inch screws for almost everything on the table, including the pocket holes. Those are 2.5-inch screws. And I believe there were a couple of spots that we used 1.5-inch screws. But for the most part, we did 2.5-inch screws. Almost all of the screws were the pocket holes for the framing, and then we did use the regular screws for like these brackets here and to screw the legs onto the table, and those we just had laying around the house that we'd collected from other projects. Whenever you're doing a build like this, definitely have someone to help you if you can, and if not, use your clamps and other things to help you. Here you'll see we didn't put that middle brace in the exact spot, so we had to unscrew it and screw it and move it over and re-screw it back to the framing, which was no big deal. All it's there for is to make sure that your tabletop has a good enough support for anything that you put on top of the table. So we're just going to move that over a little bit so that we can screw these brackets onto that support beam to hold up our shelf here. And again, we didn't use the pocket holes here. We just screwed directly into the 2x4s. Nobody's going to see it, so we weren't worried about it. And here we're using that clamp to hold the bracket in place so that he doesn't have to try to hold it and screw those screws in at the same time. I let him do a lot of the work just because he enjoys it. There are a few things you'll see me doing when he's trying to teach me a few things. And here we're talking about this piece here we cut straight, but as you can see where those brackets are down there, we have to notch it out. So we're talking and discussing on what the best way to notch that out would be. And he's showing me how he's going to do it. And then basically what we did was we laid it in one side and then drew a line where the 2x4 braces were, and then measured, and he showed me that a 2x4 is not really 2x4 inches. It's a little bit smaller than that. Here's the finished product, and I'll have a couple other pictures here to show you what else we've done to it. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you so much for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.